Have you ever heard of an enemy so ruthless that God himself declared he would fight against them through every generation? A deceitful people who never fought their opponents openly, but struck from behind, always preying on the tired, the weak, and those who could not defend themselves. This people appear again and again in the Bible, carrying a reputation of violence, rebellion against God, and endless hostility toward Israel. Today, we will step into the history of the Amalekites, a people who became a living picture of resistance against God's will, and at the same time, an example of his unshakable justice. What you are about to hear may change how you understand some of the most unforgettable battles in Scripture. The Amalekites were descendants of Amalek, grandson of Esau, the brother of Jacob. Their bloodline was not foreign, but directly connected to Israel's own family, both tracing back to Isaac and Rebekah. Because of this, every clash between them carried far more than political or territorial weight. It was spiritual at its core, almost as if the ancient struggle between Esau and Jacob kept echoing through their descendants. Jacob's children were chosen to carry the promise, set apart as guardians of God's covenant, called to live not merely as a nation, but as a holy people belonging to him. On the other side, Amalek's descendants chose the opposite path. They rejected faith in God. They refused his law. They denied his authority. They lived in rebellion, wandering as nomads through the deserts without spiritual foundation, relying on violence instead of hope in a promise. Their home was the barren land of the Negev, where the burning sun allowed no mercy, and water was as rare as treasure. In that harsh wilderness, they became strong and resilient, yet their strength did not form them into wise or noble people. It hardened them into cruelty. What defined them was not survival alone, but the mercilessness that became their identity. The desert gave them endurance, but they turned it into brutality. They became known as raiders and plunderers, remembered not for kindness or wisdom, but for the violence they unleashed on anyone who crossed their way. More than ordinary enemies, the Amalekites came to embody direct opposition to God's plan. They were like a shadow always against the light. Where Israel represented promise, Amalek represented resistance. Where Israel symbolized faith and obedience, Amalek embodied defiance and wickedness. Their first recorded battle with Israel happened at Rephidim, shortly after the Exodus. Israel was a nation freshly freed from slavery, still learning what it meant to walk in freedom when the Amalekites struck. The people of Israel still carried the heavy burden of generations of slavery on their backs, and their hearts swayed between hope and doubt. In the wilderness, freedom was a painful lesson, tested by hunger, thirst, and the endless struggles of the journey. They were like children just learning how to walk, weak and unsure, yet guided by the unseen hand of God through the leadership of Moses. It was at this exact moment of weakness that the Amalekites struck. They did not march out openly to challenge Israel. They did not declare war with honor. Instead, they attacked with deceit, taking advantage of a tired and unprepared people. Like silent hunters, they crept around the edges of the camp, striking where the defenseless were, the elderly who moved slowly, mothers burdened with small children, and the sick who could barely go on. This was no fair fight. It was a cowardly assault disguised as battle. In that moment, the Amalekites revealed more than their military tactics. They revealed their very nature, a people without reverence for God and without mercy for human life. Their war was not just against Israel, but against all that Israel stood for: the promise of God, the life of faith, and the presence of the Lord among his chosen ones. Moses recognized the seriousness of this threat. He knew this was not just another desert skirmish, but a danger that could wipe out Israel's identity and future. There was no time to hesitate. He called for Joshua, a young man already showing the heart of a leader, and gave him the responsibility of assembling men to fight. For the first time, the Israelites would not march as runaway slaves. They would rise as warriors, ready to defend the inheritance God had sworn to give them. While Joshua went down into the valley to lead the soldiers, Moses took a different path, the path of faith instead of the sword. Climbing the mountain with Aaron and Hur, he positioned himself as an intercessor, depending not on his own strength but on God's. And it was there, on that height, that a single act gained eternal weight. Moses lifted his hands toward heaven. That simple gesture was more than a stance. It was a declaration that victory would come, not by human power, but by the mighty hand of the Lord. Whenever his hands stayed raised, Israel gained ground against the Amalekites, but when his arms grew heavy and lowered, the enemy pushed forward. In that struggle, the truth became clear. The battle was not only fought on the dry soil of Rephidim, but also in the unseen realm, where prayer, faith, and obedience decide the outcome of history. This mystery revealed a truth that would echo for generations, that it is not the sharpness of the sword that ensures victory for God's people, but steadfastness in prayer. It is not the warrior's skill that secures victory, but the faithfulness of the one who prays and stands firm before the throne of the Most High. When Moses grew weary and could no longer keep his arms lifted, Aaron and Hur did not stand by passively. They understood how serious the moment was and came alongside him, each one holding up an arm so they would not fall. Together they kept his hands steady until the sun went down. That scene was more than an act of human support. It became a living picture of unity in God's plan. 3 men, each with a different role, but bound together by the same mission. Moses interceded, Joshua fought, Aaron and Hur supported. Each one played his part, and together they shared in the victory. That day, Israel won its first battle as a nation, but it was not simply the story of a military win against a deceitful enemy. It was the beginning of a spiritual truth that would shape Israel's history. The lesson at Rephidim was clear. God's victories are not won only on the battlefield, but also in the hidden prayers of those who stand before him. The valley and the mountain became symbols joined forever. While some hold swords, others lift hands, and only in the union of both does true victory come. After that battle, God made sure no one would forget. It was not to remain just a memory passed down in stories around the fire. The Lord himself commanded Moses to write it down, to preserve it as a permanent reminder and a decree for the future. The Amalekite attack would never be forgotten, and God's judgment against them would echo from generation to generation until their name was erased from the earth. This was not the result of sudden anger, nor just payback for cowardice. It was God's righteous judgment against a people who not only struck Israel in their weakness, but in doing so, rose in defiance against the Lord himself. What was at stake was far greater than weary travelers or fragile bodies. It was the eternal plan of the Creator. The same purpose that carried Israel toward the promise was being opposed, and to attack the weak was, in truth, to challenge the God who sustains the weak and makes the powerless walk forward. Centuries later, in Deuteronomy 25, God's voice still thundered with the same certainty, reminding his people of what happened at Rephidim. He recalled not only the battle itself, but the cruelty of Amalek's method. They did not face Israel in open combat, nor seek an honest fight. They struck from behind, targeting the tired, the frail, those who could no longer keep pace. This was more than violence. It was contempt for mercy, arrogance against reverence, and the pure expression of hearts hardened against God. That is why the Lord's decree was not just a temporary command, but a lasting judgment. It was a solemn and eternal judgment, written into Israel's history as an unavoidable duty. When the people would one day find peace in the promised land, they were commanded to carry out the divine order, to erase the memory of Amalek from under heaven. No trace, no remembrance, no chance for their pride to echo through future generations. The Amalekites became more than just an enemy nation. They became a symbol, a living picture of rebellion that constantly rose up against the purposes of the Most High. The fight against them was not simply about territory between neighbors, but the carrying out of God's justice, which stretches beyond time and borders. Their sentence became a solemn warning for every age. Though evil may seem to succeed for a time, though the wicked may boast over the weakness of the righteous, they will never escape God's judgment. The Lord is just, and his justice always arrives at the right time, even if to human eyes it seems delayed. The story of Amalek was not only about a defeated enemy, it was about the Lord's faithfulness in protecting his people. It was proof that God hears the cries of the weak, that he does not overlook injustice, and that his judgment is as sure as the sunrise over the desert sands. As the years rolled on, generations passed, nations disappeared, empires rose and collapsed. Yet the word of the Lord stood firm, unshaken like an eternal rock. What had been declared at Rephidim when the Amalekites dared to stand not only against Israel, but against God himself, was never forgotten, not in the dust of the desert nor in the memory of heaven. Judgment was preserved, waiting for the time appointed by the Lord. When that hour arrived, God once more brought his promise into action. Through the prophet Samuel, the command was given to King Saul to completely destroy the Amalekites. No mercy, no sparing, no memory left of their name or possessions. Men and women, children and servants, livestock and treasure, all were to be placed under God's judgment, as if heaven's fire itself erased the memory of a people whose very identity was rebellion. This mission was not about conquest. It was not a war for Israel's glory or a battle to gain wealth, land, or honor. It was something far more serious, an execution of divine justice. It was not about plunder, but judgment, not about victory, but about cleansing. Saul, however, though he carried out part of the Lord's command, failed to obey completely. He gathered his army, marched against the Amalekites, and won a great victory. His soldiers crushed their enemies and destroyed their cities. Yet instead of wiping out everything as God had ordered, Saul chose to spare what looked valuable. The Amalekite king, Agag, was left alive. This was no small matter. Agag was not just another ruler. He was the very symbol of defiance against the Lord. His name carried the weight of violence and bloodshed. Under his reign, raids and plundering had spread terror across Israel and neighboring peoples. He stood as the continuation of a dark line of cruelty and rebellion. To let him live was to preserve the root of the very evil God had commanded to be destroyed. And it was not only Agag that Saul spared. He and his soldiers kept the best of the spoil, the finest sheep, oxen, lambs, and treasures, the healthiest animals, and the most precious possessions, all of which were meant for destruction, were set aside as plunder. Saul then cloaked his disobedience in religious appearance, claiming he had saved them to offer as sacrifices to the Lord. But in God's eyes, that excuse was hollow. What Saul failed to see was that the spoils were a test of loyalty. The Lord had no need for animals or riches, for he owns all of creation. The command to destroy everything was not about livestock or gold. It was about obedience of the heart. By sparing the herds and treasures, Saul revealed where his trust truly lay, not in God's word, but in the fleeting value of wealth. Behind the mask of devotion, Saul's weakness was exposed, his inability to fully obey. What looked like zeal was actually rebellion disguised as worship. The king twisted God's clear command to fit his own desires, trading obedience for the appearance of piety. In doing so, he showed that it is possible to win battles before men and yet lose before God, to bring offerings to the altar but lose the favor of the Almighty. When Samuel confronted him, he did not find a king humbled by his failure, but a man desperate to defend himself. Saul hurried to meet the prophet as though seeking praise, trying to cover his disobedience with words of devotion. He offered excuses as if they were sacrifices, attempting to turn rebellion into an act of worship. But Samuel, speaking with God's authority, saw through the charade. His words, echoing across the ages, cut like a sword. To obey is better than sacrifice, and to listen better than the fat of rams. In those words, Samuel was not speaking only to Israel's king, but laying down a principle that would stand for all generations of faith. God does not delight in rituals meant to cover up a rebellious heart. He takes no pleasure in altars filled with sacrifices when the hands that bring them refuse to obey. What holds the covenant together is not outward shows of devotion, but a heart that is humble, sincere, and fully yielded to His will. Within the very story of Israel, an eternal lesson was written. Disobedience, even when dressed in good intentions, is still unfaithfulness before God. True worship is not in endless sacrifices, but in hearts that bow without resistance. Worship without obedience is empty. Religion without surrender is rejected. Filled with holy indignation, Samuel lifted his voice as both prophet and judge of the Lord. To the king who had failed his command, he declared the irreversible sentence: Saul was rejected as king because he had rejected the word of the Most High. The man chosen to lead Israel, the first to sit on its throne, would not lose his crown to foreign armies, but to his own disobedience. A reign that could have been remembered for faithfulness and blessing became instead a fragile throne, eaten away by pride and rebellion. Before the people, Samuel himself carried out the task Saul had left undone. The prophet could not undo the past, but he could show Israel that the Lord's judgment is not to be bargained with or delayed. Agag, king of the Amalekites, was brought before Samuel. The man walked with pride, perhaps believing his life had been spared as a sign of victory or mercy. His face showed the arrogance of one who, though beaten in battle, still thought himself untouchable by human justice. But Samuel, in the name of the Lord, left no room for arrogance before the decree of heaven. There, in full view of Israel, the prophet struck Agag down, ending the life of the man who embodied rebellion against God. The act was severe, bloody, and final, but it was not personal revenge. It was not senseless violence. It was the execution of the judgment God Himself had spoken. With that act, Samuel made it clear: the word of the Lord cannot be bent, delayed, or reshaped for human convenience. What God commands must be done, even if it appears harsh to human eyes. That day became a turning point in Israel's story, echoing as a solemn warning across the ages. It is not enough to be involved in God's work. You must obey completely. In the sight of the Lord, partial obedience is no obedience at all. Saul's failure cost him more than a single mission. It cost him the kingdom itself. His crown did not fall before enemy swords. It crumbled beneath the weight of his own unfaithfulness. Saul's downfall became an example for all generations. No one can play with God's will or try to cover disobedience with religious excuses. Faith that disobeys is not faith at all. Worship that ignores God's command is not worship, but an offense. This story shows us that true greatness in a leader is not found in power or strategy, but in complete obedience to the Lord's voice. When Saul was rejected, God raised up David, a man after His own heart, to reign over Israel. Unlike Saul, David stood firm against the Amalekites. When they attacked, he held nothing back, leaving no opening for their defiance. In decisive battles, he won overwhelming victories, rescuing families who had been taken, recovering the stolen goods, and restoring hope to his people. Where fear had spread, he brought courage. Where oppression had weighed down, he brought relief. And where the memory of Amalekite treachery remained, David raised the banner of victory under the hand of God. Yet even then, the Amalekites were not wiped out immediately. Though often defeated, small groups managed to survive in the shadows of history. It was only years later, during the reign of King Hezekiah, that the last remnants were finally destroyed at Mount Seir. There, at last, the Lord's word was completely fulfilled, and Israel found peace in the land. These victories carry a lasting message. The enemy may resist for a season, but before faithfulness and obedience to God, victory is certain and complete. What seems delayed is not forgotten. God's timing is always perfect. He never fails, never forgets, and never abandons his people. The story of the Amalekites is more than an old record. It is a living testimony with lessons that still speak today. One of the first lessons is the importance of full obedience to God. Saul tried to walk halfway, obeying part of the Lord's command, but his partial obedience cost him the throne and God's approval. With God, there is no middle ground. We either obey fully or we reject his will. Another lesson is that the Amalekites became the symbol of resistance to God's purposes. They remind us that in our own lives, we will also face opposition, challenges that test our faith, shake our confidence, and tempt us to give up. But just as with Israel, our victory is certain when we trust God completely, when we stay steadfast through struggles, and when we stand together in prayer and perseverance. This account also warns us against cruelty and cowardice. The Amalekites' treacherous attacks show us that evil may seem to succeed for a time, but it will always bring consequences. On the other hand, faithfulness, justice, and integrity remain the paths of blessing. Every action matters before God, who is just in both judgment and reward. Finally, the Amalekite story reminds us that God is faithful to all his promises. Even if the enemy resists, even if the battles feel endless, God acts at the right time. His justice stands, his hand guides, his presence protects. Israel faced visible enemies, but today we face both inner and outward struggles. The message remains the same. With faith, obedience, and unity, no enemy can stand against the power of our God. May this truth strengthen your heart and encourage you to trust him fully, even when the battles seem larger than your strength. He walks with you, upholds your life, and gives victory to those who refuse to give up. If this message touched your heart, help spread the word by leaving a like and subscribing to the channel. This way, you'll receive more content every week that will strengthen your faith. Don't forget to hit the notification bell so you don't miss any updates. And I'd love to hear from you. What part of this story spoke to you the most? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Let's grow and encourage one another in faith. Thank you for staying until the end. See you soon.